6.1c is on multiplying radicals. So we've added and subtracted and simplified, and now we are going to multiply. So remember, we are still trying to simplify our radicals into their simplest radical form. So that means we can have no perfect squares underneath our radical, right? We can have no radicals in the bottom of our fraction, and we can't have a fraction underneath our radical. So those are the rules we're keeping in mind when we are simplifying. Also remember that for your radical, you are either in jail or out of jail, right? You're either stuck inside your radical or you come outside of the radical. It's one or the other. So you can apply multiplying and dividing properties to the numbers if they are under the radical. Okay, so that means if we had two things, right, two things that were both under radicals, we could combine them into one radical and multiply. So that's what we're going to practice today. So just to see how this works, if we were to take different values for a and b and practice taking the square root of a times b and compare that to taking the square root of a times the square root of b, let's see what happens. Well, the square root of 4 times 9 would be the square root of 36, which is just 6. The square root of a would be 4 times the square root of b, which would be the square root of 9. Well, the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 9 is 3. 2 times 3 is 6. So notice how we get the same answer. And that's why this works. So basically what we're saying is for all of these radicals, we can either write them as a square root of like 25 times 4, or we can pull them apart into two separate square roots. So that's the gist of today's lesson. We're going to practice multiplying things, and so just keep in mind that you can combine things into one radical, or you can pull them apart into two different radicals. So let's look at a couple different examples. Letter A, we have 5 times the square root of 300. So we're going to start off simplifying just like we've been in the past. Well, 300 we could write as 3 times 100, and 100 is 10 times 10. Now I'm going to stop there because that's already a group of 2. If you want to keep factoring it, you could. So I could write this as 5 times the square root of 3 times 10 squared. Well, now we're just simplifying. The square root of 3 is just going to stay the square root of 3. But the square root of 10 squared, those cancel each other out. So we just have a 10 that comes outside of our radical. Now remember, all of this is multiplying. So now that we have our 5 and our 10 outside of the radical, since they are both outside, we can multiply them together. Okay, so since these are both outside, we can multiply them together to get 50 times the square root of 3 would be our final answer. Now would be a good time to pause and try letter B. Letter B, we have 3 times the square root of 125. Well, 125 we could write as 5 times 25, and 25 we could write as 5 times 5. So we could rewrite this as 3 times the square root of 5 squared, here's our group of 2, times 5. And again, we're just simplifying. The 3 is going to stay outside the radical. The square root of 5 squared, those will cancel each other out, so we have a 5 that comes out of our radical because we took the square roots of 5 squared. And then the square root of 5, we can't take that, so that's just stuck inside there forever. It's stuck in jail. Now you have 3 times 5. Well, 3 times 5 is 15, so 15 square roots of 5 would be our answer. So this is what we're doing. We're just practicing if two things are outside of the radical, we can multiply them together. Let's look at if two things are inside the radical. So letter C, we have 6 times the square root of 15. So we can do this a couple different ways. You can multiply them together. So we could start off and we could say, well, since they're both under the radical, we could write this as the square root of 6 times 15, which is just the square root of 90. And now that we have the square root of 90, we could simplify. It would be 9 times 10. And here's our group of 2. So it would be the square root of 3 squared times 2 times 5, right? Those are all of our factors. And then we take the square root just like we've been doing. The square root of 3 squared is just going to be 3 because these cancel each other out. We can't take the square root of 2. We can't take the square root of 5. However, we do know what 2 times 5 is. So our final answer would be 3 times the square root of 10. And so the simplifying should be really similar. It should be familiar. You should understand all of this work. The new part that we are talking about today is just this concept of taking two radicals that are separate and merging them into one. Or taking a radical that's together and pulling it apart into two different ones. Letter D, now would be a good time to pause and see if you can do it for yourself. So if I didn't want to multiply 13 by 52, because those are pretty big numbers, I could start off by simplifying. I know that 52 is 13 times 4. So now I could combine this into 13, right, this 13, times this 13, times 4. And that would be the same as 13 times 52. So now that I pulled that apart, I could write this as the square root of 13 squared times 4. And now, look at this. Now it'll be really easy for me to simplify. So the square root of 13 squared is just going to be 13. The square root of 4, well, we know what that is. That's 2. So everything comes out of our radical. And so we just have 2 times 13 leaves us with our answer of 26. This bottom one, square root of 2 times square root of 12 is just extra if you want to practice. Looking at letter E. So thinking way back, we did talk about the distributive property. So E and F are talking about the distributive property where we have something outside a set of parentheses and it's our job to multiply it by everything in our set of parentheses. So for this, we really need to remember our outside versus our inside rules. If they're outside, you can multiply them together. If they're two things are inside, you can multiply them together, but you can't take something outside and multiply it by something inside. So letter E, we have the square root of 2 times 5 minus the square root of 8. So looking, notice that the square root of 2 is inside and 5 is outside, which means 5 has to stay outside and 2 has to stay inside. So 5 times the square root of 2 is the most simplified that we can write that. The square root of 2 times the square root of 8, we'll notice that both of those are inside the radical, so we can combine those into one radical. Well, 5 times the square root of 2 is just going to stay 5 times the square root of 2. 2 times 8 is actually 16, so I know that the square root of 16 is 4. Well, 5 times the square root of 2 minus 4. We don't have any like terms, and there's nothing else we can simplify, so that would be our final answer. So looking at letter F, would be a good idea to pause and try it for yourself. We have 2 times 2. Notice how they are both outside the radical, so we can multiply them together. And we have 2 times the square root of 3. 2 is outside, so it has to stay outside. The square root of 3 is inside, so it has to stay inside. Well, 2 times 2 would just be 4 plus 2 times the square root of 3. We can't combine anything else. We don't have like terms to add together, so that is our final answer. So we're just taking our simplifying and our adding and subtracting properties, and we're adding this idea of multiplying. We have a couple more examples. So letter G, same type of thing. We're just distributing. So we're going to take the square root of 3, and we're going to multiply it by 5 times the square root of 2. And we're going to take the square root of 3 and multiply it by 2 times the square root of 6. So I'm going to combine for this first term. Well, 5 is on the outside. 3 and 2 are inside of our radical, so I can combine those. For this second term, 2 is on the outside. 3 and 6 are inside my radical, so I can combine those. Well, 3 and 2, I don't have a group of 2 there, and they're already simplified, so this is just going to be 5 times the square root of 6. Well, 2 is on the outside. Here, I can simplify 6 into 3 times 2, which gives us this group of 2 right here. So we could rewrite this as 2 times the square root of 3 squared times 2. And now we're just simplifying. Remember, we already decided that 5 squared to 6 is the most simplified this can get. We still have 2. The square root of 3 squared is going to be 3, and then this 2 is stuck inside our radical. So just to finish this off, we would have 5 times the square root of 6 minus 6 times the square root of 2. We don't have any like terms. We don't have anything else we can simplify, so that is our final answer. It'd be a really good idea to pause and try letter H for yourself. So letter H, we have 3 times the square root of 2, and we're multiplying that by the square root of 24. So 3 is on the outside, it's got to stay on the outside, but 2 and 24 are both inside our radicals, so we can combine those. And then we want to take 3 times the square root of 2 times 2 times the square root of 6. So I'm just going to write that out first. 3 times the square root of 2 times 2 times the square root of 6. And let's see what we have here. Well, 2 times 24, I could multiply that to get 48, or I could just start simplifying. This would be 2 times 12. This would be 4 times 3. So here we have a group of 2, a group of 2, and a 3 all by itself. So we could really write this as 3 times the square root of 2 squared from that group of 2, 2 squared from that group of 2, times 3. And then for our second term, we'll notice that we have a 3 and a 2 outside, so we'd have 3 times 2 outside, and we have a 2 and a 6 inside, so 2 times 6 inside. So it's really all about combining your outsides and your insides, and then simplifying if you can. Well, we're still going to have a 3. The square root of 2 squared is 2. The square root of 2 squared is 2 again, and this 3 is just stuck inside our radical forever, plus 3 times 2 is 6 times the square root of, well, 2 times 6, we can actually simplify that into a group of 2. So again, that'd be 2 squared times 3. Well, we're almost done here. 3 times 2 is 6 times another 2 would be 12 square roots of 3. Here we would have a 2 come out, so this would be plus 12 square roots of 3. Well, 12 square roots of 3 plus 12 square roots of 3, we can actually combine that into 24, right? Because 12 plus 12 is 24. 24 what? 24 square roots of 3. And that would be our final answer. So, again, we're taking everything we've learned about adding and subtracting and simplifying, and then we are adding in this extra step of multiplying. So we're just building on those previous concepts. Main thing to remember for multiplying is that you are either outside or you are inside. If you're inside, you can combine them with other things inside. If you're outside, you can combine it with other things outside, but you can't move it to the other place unless you take the square root. And always check to see that they're completely simplified.